right. Hi, welcome. All right, here we go. About a year ago, a new book took the diplomatic world by a storm. This book, titled Destined for War, Can America and China Escape the Thucydides Trap?, addresses the engaging, if somewhat apocalyptic, question, are the U.S. and China destined for a military showdown? The author, Graham Allison, is a professor of applied history. That is, he uses the past to make predictions about the future. And for the past decade or so, he and a team of Harvard graduate students have studied the diplomatic history of several historical situations where a rising power is threatening an existing power. I won't go into more details about this book's method and conclusions, though I do recommend the book heartily, but I begin with it today because of its subtitle. Thucydides, as I probably don't need to remind you, was a Greek historian of the 5th century BCE who wrote one book, the magisterial History of the Peloponnesian War. This book recounts how Sparta, the reigning military power, found Athens, the up-and-coming power, more and more of a threat, until a brutal 27-year war broke out, which Sparta ultimately won, but which depleted the wealth of both and left Greece vulnerable to attack by the Macedonians. I want to ask, why is it that in order to address the most pressing diplomatic questions of our time, U.S. versus China, we would go back to an author of 2,500 years ago to shape our understanding? And of course, one answer to this question would be, why not? Greek authors, including Thucydides, have formed the core of higher learning for most of the history of the West. They form our literary inheritance. Here in America, our founding fathers were familiar with the stories of Athens and Sparta. Every educated person was, through the Greek and Latin authors they studied in the grammar schools of their day. It is only in our living memory that the idea of handing down our Greek heritage has been allowed to wither. So the killer app for this lecture is the Greek literary inheritance. We will not be able to look at all of it. The philosophers and the tragedians will have to wait. I'm going to talk about 3 Greek authors who have formed the West: Homer, Herodotus, and Thucydides. And I will also give a brief but special mention to a 4th, Demosthenes. All right, so let's talk about the Greeks. Greek civilization developed on a rocky peninsula where communication was difficult and roads were few. The easiest means of transport was by sea. The city-state, or polis, grew up in relative isolation from every other city-state. I stress relative because the isolation was primarily limited to the political sphere. The city-states shared a common Greek culture, language, religion, shared stories about their war with Troy, and they also shared a common idea about how to govern, which was they believed in self-governance. If you know Greek history, you know that Athens and Sparta emerged as the strongest of the hundreds of cities. You know that Athens became an enormous economic powerhouse with colonies on the coast of Asia Minor and in southern Italy and even France. In terms of population, Athens was about 10 times the size of the average city-state. And as you would expect for a political entity that had overseas colonies, Athens had a great navy. Sparta, as you can see on the map, is located further inland than Athens. It has a great army, but no navy. If you know Sparta's backstory, you know that Sparta is in a rather delicate situation. Having conquered its neighbors and enslaved them, the Helots, they were now committed to a life of military preparedness in order to preempt any slave uprising. Despite their political independence, it was the stories of Homer, circulating for many hundreds of years before they were finally written down, that stitched together these independent cities into one culture. The Iliad and Odyssey told about the Trojan War, and you can see Troy up here on our map as well, a war that had united the Greek city-states in a common cause. Troy, located on the coast of Asia Minor in modern Turkey, was the great enemy because Paris, the prince of Troy, had stolen Helen, the wife of the Greek king Menelaus, known for all eternity now as Helen of Troy. Yet even though the Iliad tells the story of a 10-year war against Greek's enemies, the enemy is never demonized. The Trojans are depicted as great heroes, and some of the most touching portraits, some of the most moving, are of the Trojans themselves. I'm thinking of the incomparable goodbye scene between the Trojan hero Hector and his wife Andromache. Hector looked at his son in silence with a smile. Andromache stood close to him, weeping. Taking Hector by the hand, she spoke to him. "My dear husband, your warlike spirit will be your death. You've no compassion for your infant child, for me, your sad wife, who before long will be your widow. For soon the Achaeans will attack you all together and cut you down. I have no father, no dear mother, for Lord Achilles killed my father when he wiped out Thebes. I had 7 brothers in my home. All went down to Hades in a single day, for swift-footed Lord Achilles killed them all while they were guarding their shambling oxen and their white, shining sheep. So pity me. Stay here in this tower. Don't orphan your child and make me a widow." Great Hector of the shining helmet answered her, "Wife, all this concerns me too, but I'd be disgraced, dreadfully shamed among Trojan men and Trojan women in their trailing gowns, if I should, like a coward, slink away from war. My heart will never prompt me to do that, for I have learned always to be brave, to fight alongside Trojans at the front, striving to win fame for father and myself." With these words, glorious Hector stretched his hands out for his son. And here's the really touching part. The boy immediately shrank back against the breast of the finely girdled nurse, crying out in terror to see his own dear father, scared at the sight of bronze, the horsehair plume nodding fearfully from his helmet top. The child's loving father laughed, his noble mother too. Glorious Hector pulled the glittering helmet off and set it on the ground. Then he kissed his dear son and held him in his arms. He prayed aloud to Zeus and the rest of the immortals. "Zeus, all you other gods, grant that this child, my son, may become like me, preeminent among the Trojans, as strong and brave as me. Grant that he may rule Troy with strength. May people someday say as he returns from war, this man is far better than his father." The Greeks ultimately won this war against the Trojans, but they did it by treachery, not by heroism. The Persians divided their land. Oh, excuse me. Where am I? Sorry. Not by heroism. Specifically, the clever idea of the Trojan horse, dreamed up by Odysseus, was the winning strategy. As far as heroism goes, Homer would have us understand the sides were pretty evenly matched. So, by the year 500 BCE, the Greek world had expanded well beyond the Greek peninsula. And so you can see here in the dark yellow color that the Greek world included the coast of Asia Minor, what's known as the Ionian Coast, many dozens of islands, including Crete. And all of them shared this culture, including Homer, and this language and this religion. Around the year 500, the Ionian coast came under Persian rule as Persia expanded under Darius. Now, we've looked a little bit at Persia already, and we know that the Persian Empire was actually one of the most enlightened places on earth. The Persian Empire was the largest land empire the world had ever seen. It's been estimated that about 50% of the world's population lived under its rule. Persia was able to conquer, and really more importantly, was able to maintain this enormous land empire because of its approach to governance. Rather than the rapacious attitude of earlier empires, such as the Assyrians and the Babylonians, looting, demanding a crushing amount of annual tribute from tributary kingdoms, the Persians divided their land into satrapies. They built roads, they established uniform weights and measures, and they were known to tax moderately and fairly. Just as important, when the Persian emperor selected a satrap, that is, the man to be the governor of each of these satrapies, he deliberately chose a well-regarded local person. This way, he had someone that the people in the satrapy would respect, and by being raised up and recognized in this way, he assured that this locally powerful person would not head up a rebellion. What more could you ask? Being conquered by the Persians was not a fate worse than death, or even a very bad fate at all. It is actually from a Greek source, Herodotus, that we learn these favorable details about the Persian Empire. Herodotus was born and raised in Halicarnassus, a city-state on the southern end of the Ionian Coast. So there you can see Miletus and Rhodes, and there's Halicarnassus right there on the coast of modern Turkey. Herodotus tells us about the roads, the common currency, the way of governing, and he even tells us about the Persian postal system. This was the first postal system in recorded history. He described the speed and the reliability of this system in words that ended up on Manhattan's Central Post Office and which became the unofficial motto of the U.S. Postal Service. You may recognize it. Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds. These couriers are the Persian couriers. But, as I said, the Persians have conquered freedom-loving Greeks. So let's go back to this slide. The kind of freedom the Greeks love is very narrowly defined. It's the freedom of self-government. And so one of the city-states rebels. Athens lends support. They sack the capital city of the local satrapy, Sardis, which you can also see on the map a little inland from the coast. And now the Persians are angry. They send a small army to attack, and the Persians are defeated at Marathon, and they go away in disgrace. 10 years later, under King Xerxes, the Persians return. This time the Persians are ready. They return by land and by sea, defeating the legendary 300 Spartans at Thermopylae. They sail to what they think will be an easy victory at Athens. So the X's are a little hard to see, but if you look there on the map of mainland Greece, there's an X on the Thermopylae and then another one at Marathon, and then you'll see a third X down below. They defeat the Spartans at Thermopylae. They sail to what they think will be an easy victory at Athens. Xerxes sets up a throne on an overlooking hilltop as though to enjoy the spectacle. The Persians sack and burn the city of Athens, but the city has been abandoned, and the Persians' enormous ships carrying their enormous army are lured into the straits near Salamis, which the Athenians have fled to. So that's where the larger X is there, the Bay of Salamis. The Persians are trapped and unable to turn around, and the Athenian navy rams their ships. Persian soldiers who'd planned to fight on land are thrown overboard, and unable to swim, they die by the thousands. As Victor Davis Hanson has described it in his book about Greek warfare, it must be a terrible thing to drown at sea, arms thrashing the waves, lungs filling with brine, the body slowly growing heavy and numb, the brain crackling and sparking at its last molecules of oxygen and as they're exhausted. By day's end in late September 480 BC, a third of the sailors of the Persian fleet were now precisely in those awful last moments of their existence. A few miles from the burned Athenian Acropolis, as many as 40,000 of Xerxes' imperial subjects were bobbing in the depths and on the waves, the dead, the dying, and the desperate, amid the wrecks of more than 200 triremes. All were doomed far from Asia in the warm coastal waters of the Aegean, all destined for the bottom of the Saronic Gulf. Their last sight on earth was a Greek sunset over the mountains of Salamis, or their grim king perched far away on Mount Aegiolus, watching them sink beneath the waves. Unlike battle on terra firma, where lethality is so often predicated on the technology of death and not on the landscape of battle itself, war at sea is a primordial killer of men, in which the ocean itself can wipe out thousands without the aid of either man or his weapons. At Salamis, most died from water in the lungs, not steel in their bodies. So no matter who did the killing, it's clear that this was a great victory for the Greeks. Herodotus is our source for this and all other facts about the Persians and the Persian Wars. In writing about these battles, Herodotus not only invents the genre we call history, he calls his work histories, meaning inquiries, he doesn't shy away from broadcasting the greatness of the Persians. It is, after all, their very greatness that makes the Greek victory a great victory. When he frames his account of the clash between the Greeks and the Persians, Herodotus makes it clear that he wants to uncover the causes of the war, but equally, like Homer, he wants to remember the heroism on both sides. He writes in his opening lines, "This is the account of the inquiries of Herodotus of Halicarnassus, so that things done by man not be forgotten in time, and that great and marvelous deeds, some displayed by the Hellenes, some by the barbarians, not lose their glory, including, among other things, what was the cause of their waging war on each other." Herodotus gives us an underdog narrative par excellence, and he gives us an explanation for why this tiny underdog could have defeated the greatest empire the world had ever known. The idea, which he develops at length, has to do with character. The Greeks are freedom-loving people, unlike the Persians, who are wealthy and thus decadent, who are happy being subject to a king so long as he brings peace, security, and wealth. Unlike the Greek armies, which are citizen armies, that is, free people fighting for their home, the Persians have a slave army. And this explains, according to Herodotus, why they can defeat this much larger slave army. The Greeks love their freedom and independence, and unlike a slave, they're willing to fight to the death for it. One by one, Herodotus describes the Greek cities on the Ionian Coast, each deciding whether they want to rebel against the Persians or remain under Persian rule. The entire discussion of this opening of the book, this is the build-up to war, and it is a disquisition on the definition of freedom. What constitutes slavery? What constitutes freedom? Who is a slave? Who is free? Is a slave merely someone who can be whipped? Are the Greek citizens going to be slaves of Xerxes? Interestingly, Herodotus presents Xerxes as obsessed by the relative poverty of the Greek lands. It's inconceivable to Xerxes that the Greek leaders could not be bribed. How could they prefer their impoverished freedom over the wealth and luxury that Persia offered? The inheritance from Herodotus is unmistakable in American history. Here was the first articulation of the idea that we in the West are different. We love freedom. You can understand why this narrative became precious to 13 tiny colonies thinking of rebelling against the greatest empire of the late 18th century. Here was the promise that an underdog who takes on a tyrant, even a gigantic one, can have hope of success because of the strength these convictions lend to his willingness to fight. So, to summarize, the city-states banded together to fight off the Persians, and in just a few battles, the Greeks win. After this brief moment of unity, the city-states fall into disagreement. Will the Persians return? They might. After all, last time there was a gap of 10 years between Marathon and Thermopylae. Athens is certain that they should continue the fight until they have expelled the Persians from any and all Greek city-states. They organize the Delian League, they start collecting dues, and they begin this task. Little by little, it becomes obvious that Athens is enjoying its power and is using Delian League money for personal gain. They even use it to rebuild and beautify their burned out city. They build the entire Acropolis at this time. After a few decades, Athens is in every way becoming something of a tyrant itself, and there are league members who want out. Athens refuses. Other city-states now turn to Sparta for support. They create a second league, the Peloponnesian League, and within another decade or so, the two leagues are at war. The Peloponnesian War goes on for 27 years. Neither of the well-matched sides can easily gain the upper hand. Eventually, Sparta reaches out to Persia for assistance. Sparta wins, but both sides are ruined. Their wealth and prosperity are shot. Thucydides began writing his history of the Peloponnesian War while it was ongoing. He had been a general for Athens during one phase of the war. He was a patriotic Athenian who loved his city-state. All the more reason that he experienced Athens' actions as a great tragedy. Not in the sense of a sad story, but in the sense of a Greek tragedy. Both sides could surely be faulted, as Thucydides says at the outset, quote, "The real cause of the war I consider to be the growth of the power of Athens and the alarm which this inspired in Sparta." But in Thucydides' telling, Athens is a tragic hero. Like a hero of a Greek tragedy, Athens is great. Athens had a great culture and a great tradition of democratic rule. Athens demonstrated greatness in defeating the Persians and then in leading the Delian League. Athens' tragic flaw was that of hubris, excessive pride, which led to its downfall. In his telling, both praise for Athens' greatness and hints of Athens' flaws are put into the mouth of the Athenian leader Pericles. His funeral oration, delivered to Athens after the first year of the war, at a citywide funeral for fallen heroes, has been a staple of Western literature. As Pericles sings the praises of Athens' culture, its democratic political system, and its meritocratic social structure, you can also hear the note of overweening pride. Oh, this is my picture of the war. Okay. This is Pericles. Our Constitution does not copy the laws of neighboring states. We are rather a model for others to follow than imitators ourselves. Athens' government favors the many instead of the few. This is why it is called a democracy. If we look to the laws, they afford equal justice to all. If a person has no social standing, advancement in public life depends solely on his ability, class considerations not being allowed to interfere with merit. Nor again does poverty bar the way. If a man is able to serve the state, he is not hindered by coming from a poor family. Further, we provide plenty of ways for the mind to refresh itself from business. We celebrate games and sacrifices all the year round, and the elegance of our private homes forms a daily source of pleasure and helps to banish bad moods. The magnitude of our city draws the produce of the world into our harbor, so that to the Athenian, the fruits of other countries are as familiar a luxury as those of our own. In short, I say that as a city, we are the school of Hellas, and I doubt if the world can produce a man who is as versatile as the Athenian. This is no mere boast thrown out for the occasion, but plain matter of fact, for Athens alone of her contemporaries is found when tested to be greater than her reputation. We have forced every sea and land to be the highway of our daring, and everywhere, whether for evil or for good, have left imperishable monuments behind us. Such is the Athens for which these men nobly fought and died. So I think the pride there is quite obvious, and there are hints of the future tyranny about to come. In Thucydides' telling, the absolute low point is about 14 years later, when the tiny island of Melos, which through 15 years of war had managed somehow not to choose sides, came to the Athenians' attention. Melos had begun life as a Spartan colony, and Athens was not buying their claim to be neutral. The Athenians voted by majority vote in their democratic assembly to force the Melians to choose sides. In an unforgettable exchange, Thucydides' Melian dialogue, Athenian diplomats explained to the leaders of Melos that neutrality is not an option. They must either join the Delian League or be considered an enemy. The Melians appeal to common humanity, and that's dismissed. As the Athenians explain, it has always and forever been a natural law that the strong do what they want and the weak must obey. When Melos chooses not to join with the Delian League, Athens, by democratic vote, decides to punish Melos severely. All men are put to death, women and children are sold into slavery. To sum up, Herodotus taught us that we can find greatness in the enemy. Thucydides took this a step further, saying we must look facts full in the face and be willing to be self-critical. In Thucydides' telling, the Peloponnesian War is the great cautionary tale. This tale inspired leaders of the Roman Republic, and in particular Cicero, when there was concern that Rome was becoming too imperial. And it has been understood as a warning to all republics and democracies not to forget their democratic ways when dealing with foreign countries and ostensible allies. So let's finish the story of the Greeks. As I mentioned at the beginning, the Peloponnesian War left the Greek peninsula vulnerable to attack. To their great misfortune, the Macedonians, you can see Macedonia just to the north of the Greek city-states. To their great misfortune, The Macedonians under Philip of Macedon had become stronger and were absorbing neighboring lands. Demosthenes, the greatest orator in Greece, warned the Athenians that Athens must be prepared again for war. In a series of speeches that later circulated in a collection called the Philippics, Demosthenes urged Athens to prepare for war and not be fooled by Philip's overtures of peace. The war-weary Athenians dismissed Demosthenes as a warmonger, believing they could appease and live in peace with the Macedonians. When Philip of Macedon defeated Athens and its allies, Demosthenes was sentenced to death. But later generations remembered him as a great-souled Athenian who did his best to save his country. His Philippics became the model of oratory for all subsequent generations. Philip died soon after his defeat of the Athenians. He was assassinated, actually, and it was left to his son, Alexander the Great, to conquer not only Greece, but the entire Persian Empire. Alexander was a great military genius, but he was not just another conqueror. Most conquerors conquer cities, that's where the wealth is, and then work out an arrangement for extracting that wealth on a regular basis in tribute or taxation. The Persians had figured out a reasonably equitable way of doing this. Alexander the Great conquered many cities, yes, but more importantly, he built cities. Out of vanity, he names more than a dozen cities after himself, and even one after his horse. But the important thing about these cities is what they are like. They are Hellenistic cities. That is, they are cities in which he spread the cultural achievements of the Greeks, or Hellenistic culture, which is to say, the culture in particular of Athens. Hellenistic cities have the usual stuff cities have: people and marketplaces, skilled artisans and shops, but they also have Hellenistic institutions: theater, stadium, gymnasium, which is a kind of JCC where you have lectures, classes, and athletics. It's the Hellenistic institutions that where Hellenistic culture lives. The philosophic discussions, the development of scientific and mathematical ideas. Think of Pythagoras and Euclid. Think of the philosophical schools of the Stoics, Cynics, and Epicureans. Think of the healers like Galen and Hippocrates. These are some of the thinkers and thoughts produced in these Hellenistic cities. Hellenistic cities are vibrant and exciting, and I haven't even mentioned the sports and theater going on in the other institutions. There is much more to say about Hellenistic life, but what is important is that the Hellenistic cities demonstrated to all who experienced them that city life could be about more than the hustle and bustle of commercial activity. There could be lectures that speak to your understanding of what it means to be human and how to live a good life. There could be theater that challenges the relationship between the individual and the government, and that asks deep, penetrating questions, and that induces, as Aristotle said, a state of catharsis when it was over. There could be athletic competitions, staged regularly, giving people a daily encounter with human excellence and the rewards of hard work and striving for a goal. Hellenistic cities were astonishingly creative places, and anyone who could teach himself Greek and learn a skill or make enough money to live in a city was free to become a citizen and a member of its ruling class. The Jews who spoke Greek became honorary Greeks in Hellenistic cities such as Alexandria of Egypt and many cities of Asia Minor, including the city of Tarsus, where Paul the Apostle, a Greek-speaking Jew, was born. This being the first day of Hanukkah, it is tempting to say something about the Jewish experience in Jerusalem, which contradicts this happy picture, but I'm going to leave that to the rabbis. The culture spread by Alexander the Great, Hellenistic culture, becomes the culture of the Roman Empire too. This is because the eminently practical Romans do not bother to change anything they can't improve. And there was no improving on the Greeks. When the Romans got to know this culture, they adopted the literature, the religion, the mode of inquiry, and the institutions. Though they continued to speak and write in Latin, they read Greek, and they became educated in the Greek classics: Homer, Herodotus, Thucydides, Plato, Aristotle, Polybius, and the rest. Later, when Cicero warned the Roman Senate that it must take action against a looming threat, He modeled his speeches after Demosthenes, and he even called his speeches Philippics after Demosthenes' speeches about Philip. This is the word we still use for a fiery, damning speech. Thanks to the spread of the Roman Empire into Europe and from Europe into the Americas, these Greek authors have all come down to us and have been a vibrant part of Western culture. They are our Greek inheritance. In 1934, another belligerent would-be conqueror was destabilizing Europe and eventually threatening war. Most of the Western world, weary of war, chose to ignore the threat, convinced that disarming under the protocols of the League of Nations was the best way to secure peace. Even in 1938, the consensus of Western countries was to appease Hitler and in every way possible avoid war. Winston Churchill's warning speeches fell on deaf ears. Churchill, like Demosthenes, was dismissed as a raving warmonger. His speeches from the 1930s were soon compared to Demosthenes' Philippics, both for their prescience and for the chilly reception they initially received. In that same year, 1934, when then President of Columbia University, Nicholas Murray Butler, chose the names for the panels on what is now the stately Butler Library, he selected 6 Greeks and 2 Romans. They are Homer, the father of literature, Herodotus, the father of history, Sophocles, the greatest of the tragedians, Plato, the father of philosophy, Aristotle, the father of science, Demosthenes, the greatest orator, Cicero, the Roman Demosthenes, defender of the Roman Republic, who was such an inspiration to our founding fathers, and Virgil, the Roman Homer, who warned the new Roman Empire not to forget its old republican values of self-sacrifice, duty, and family devotion. It is interesting that of the 2 historians, it was Herodotus who made it to the Butler facade. It was Herodotus whose rousing saga of Greek love of liberty so inspired the founding fathers. And in the early 1930s, we in the US were more in need of a story about our love of freedom than in need of a warning about the dangers of becoming an empire ourselves. But no matter which names were ultimately chosen, what is clear is that in 1934, it was still obvious not only that we needed guidance from the Greeks, but that we owed to them our very understanding of what it meant to be educated. From Herodotus, we learn and relearn the importance of freedom. Democratic Athens is our model, but only to a point. Athens' experience in the Peloponnesian War taught all too clearly that democracy can become mob rule when it isn't tempered by the wiser heads of an aristocracy. When our founding fathers wrote the Constitution, they had these weaknesses of the Greek city-states in mind when they opted for Aristotle's mixed government, a government that would divide power between democratic, aristocratic, and monarchic institutions, the House of Representatives, the Senate, and the presidency, respectively. In his wide-ranging history exploring the roots of American order in a chapter called Glory and Ruin, Russell Kirk had this to say about the ancient Greeks. In philosophy, in warfare, in the early sciences, in poetry, in grace of manners, in rhetoric, in high cunning, the men who called themselves the Hellenes excelled all civilized folk who'd preceded them in time. In certain things, they have not been equaled in achievement, not in all these centuries since the Greek city-states themselves lost their freedom. It is my hope that, with the help of Graham Allison and others, we in the U.S. will continue to benefit from the combined wisdom of our entire Greek inheritance, that we will continue to enjoy the cultural, scientific, and literary pleasures it affords, while steadfastly holding tight to the freedom that Herodotus identified, Cicero lauded, and that our founding fathers so admired. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.